Hi, I'm Jacinta. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the National Immigration Forum. As a daughter of Chinese immigrants born and raised in the Los Angeles area, immigration is something I've thought about most of my life. But I've only focused professionally on immigration issues for the last 6 or 7 years. And as I was learning the field, I had to find those experts that I could rely on. And today's speakers are two of those experts who I continue to turn to help me shape my thinking, which makes me very excited for today's conversation. First, let me introduce Doris Meissner. Doris is a senior fellow and director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. MPI is a nonpartisan think tank that focuses on issues related to immigration and integration policies, particularly in the US and Europe, but also around the world. Doris plays a critical role at MPI, and I would even say that MPI wouldn't have come into existence without Doris, because when she was at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, she created the endowment's Immigration Policy Project, which evolved into the Migration Policy Institute in 2001. She has a wide range of experience working on immigration issues. Previously, from 1993 to 2000, she served in the Clinton administration as Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which was then a bureau of the U.S. Department of Justice. Today, its equivalent is the United States Citizenship and Integration Services at the Department of Homeland Security. And her accomplishments at that time were reforming the nation's asylum system, creating new strategies for managing U.S. borders, and improving naturalization and other services for immigrants. She's a giant in her field and a sought-after policy expert, as evidenced by the numerous distinguished boards and panels she serves on. She's authored and co-authored numerous reports, articles, op-eds, is frequently quoted in the media. Thanks so much, Doris, for joining us today.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here.
The other speaker joining us today is Alex Nowrasteh, and he is another giant and sought-after immigration policy expert. He's the Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute, which is a renowned libertarian think tank based here in DC. He's a prolific researcher and writer. His well-researched publications on pressing immigration topics of the day are relied on by immigration advocates like myself and my colleagues at the National Immigration Forum, journalists and policymakers alike. Alex is a regular source for all major print media and regularly appears on television and radio stations across the United States. He also has avid social media fans, of which I count myself as one of them. He's a native of Southern California with a background in economics, including a Master's of Science in Economic History from the London School of Economics. I'm so glad you could join us today, Alex, and welcome to both of you. So today's topic is the future of legal immigration. For those people who don't follow this issue as closely as we do, they see most of the public debate around immigration just focused on unauthorized immigrants or temporary workers. And we know that this is only one part of the immigration system. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit and help people understand who is most impacted by what we refer to as the legal immigration system, and why is it important to reform our legal immigration system. So I thought maybe we could just start with you, Doris.
Well, I'm so glad that you picked the legal immigration system to talk about for exactly the reasons that you've just said. We are completely preoccupied, legitimately, but nonetheless completely preoccupied in immigration debates with illegal immigration and issues of the border and asylum and so forth. And of course, those are important concerns, but so many of those concerns could actually be resolved if we had a functional legal immigration system that was aligned with the economy of the country and that was flexible and more up to date. I mean, we have to remember that our legal immigration system is basically grounded in changes that were made in 1965 and then again in 1990, which is really ages ago in terms of the realities of the world that we're living in now. And as a result, we don't have pathways for people to come to the country that make sense, that work for us. And as a result, there's so much pressure on the system that it can't be accommodated, that isn't accommodated through the legal immigration system, that we get more in the way of illegal immigration, that then makes the circumstances, increasingly perverse. And similarly, the enforcement of the laws that have to do with the immigration system. We are enforcing immigration laws against people who have been here for many, many years. If we had an updated legal immigration system, we would surely deal with legalization in one way or another, and we would deal with issues like employment-based immigration. Could go a long way to addressing some of the issues that have to do with the southwest border, people from Central America that don't have other ways to come, and so they try to use the asylum system inappropriately. So the fact that we can't resolve our legal immigration system in a way that is up to date and manageable, flexible with our current economy creates problems throughout the immigration realm.
Alex, so what do you think about the legal immigration system? What are the parts of it that you think need to be most reformed?
Yeah, so I just want to agree with Doris real quick and say that the legal immigration system, reforming that is the key to reforming the rest of it. If there were no changes made to enforcement along either the border or the interior, no changes made to legalizing the illegal immigrant population, but we fixed the legal system to allow more people to come here lawfully as high-skilled workers, low-skilled workers, mid-skill, family, refugees, across the board, reform the system and expanded it, a lot of these other areas of law would be able to take care of themselves. And consequently, you'd put people like me out of business. And, ultimately, I think about, my job here as trying to make my profession obsolete. I would love this system to be so reformed in that direction. But I think that the real keys to solving, or at least lowering the temperature of the immigration debate, is really resolving this issue of unauthorized and illegal immigration by fixing the legal system in the long run. And this requires expanding immigration opportunities for lower skilled workers, both temporary but also permanent, so that they're allowed to come to this country lawfully. Nobody who is a peaceful, healthy, non-criminal wants to come here illegally if they have the chance to come here legally. They would prefer to come into this country through a legal system that allows them to. The problem is we really just don't have that kind of a system anymore. It's very difficult to come here lawfully. So resolving that, expanding lower skilled immigration especially, allowing workers to come in, not just from Central America and Mexico, but from all over the world, to live, to work, to establish families, and to eventually become Americans, is really the way in the long term to get control, not only over the border, but in terms of control over visa overstays. And the analogy that a lot of people like to use is, of course, to the issue of prohibition. Alcohol and Al Capone and alcohol smuggling became a big deal because those activities were made illegal. And as soon as they legalized them, they shrank dramatically in terms of the black market impact of alcohol smuggling. I think what we really need to do to shrink the black markets, reduce the illegal immigrant population, reduce the amount of smuggling, reduce the amount of harm to human beings, both Americans and those trying to come into this country unlawfully, is to make it so that they can come legally. And that really is, I think, the key to this entire debate.
And so, what do you think, Doris? As to Alex just said that he thinks one of the most important things is to address lower skilled immigration and making sure that there are more opportunities. Is that something that you would also agree with?
Well, I think you need to, I think the fundamental problem, and Alex is pointing to, is employment-based immigration. I mean, let's just remember, we have basically 4 streams of immigration: humanitarian, which is our refugee programs; family, which is, of course, family unity; employment-based; and then diversity is probably the other one. So it's the employment-based that is really out of date and that is not sufficiently elastic to do the sorts of things that Alex talked about. And there's a good deal of talk about in this past administration and earlier administrations that actually began in the Bush administration about merit, more merit-based immigration in terms of employment flows. And I think, merit-based, that's a fine term, but merit should not equate with point systems or with highly skilled immigration. I mean, merit-based, in my opinion, should have to do with labor market needs and with where it is that immigrants add value in terms of American prosperity. We're at a time now where that is very important because as a country, we're an aging country. We are experiencing the growth in the labor market and younger workers coming only from immigration, either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. And so immigration is, we need to think about it as a human resource, as an asset for the country, and definitely important going forward if we want to be a country that continues to grow. But of course, we're also a very attractive country, and you need to figure out limits of some kind. The difficulty that we've had as a system and our three branches of government system, et cetera, is that the Congress jealously holds on to what the numbers ought to be, always has, and wants to write into statute what the numbers should be in most of the categories of our immigration system. That is not serving us well because, first of all, if you put numbers into the immigration laws, they're immediately a political negotiation because that's the nature of creating legislation, rather than being a good reflection of what might be needed in the labor market. So I do think that in pushing for legislation and in trying to deal with employment-based immigration, we have to be able to get to a debate where the Congress is willing to have some level of confidence that it maintains some degree of control, but doesn't fix into statute ceilings. And I think the only way to really do that is to legislate either ranges or legislate in the way that we've done with the Refugee Act, for instance, which is to establish in statute a normal flow, but that flow can vary from year to year based on the ability to adjust. If we could get to that kind of a debate with Congress, I think that we would be very, very much better served than we are today.
What do you think, Alex? How would you, if you had a magic wand, how would you address the flow of immigrants to the nation? Like how many? And if you can also address the idea of merit-based proposals.
Yeah, so I would try to stay away from numerical caps as much as possible, or talking about any concrete number. I think Doris is 100% right. It becomes a political lightning rod, and then we're arguing about numbers that sound scary by themselves, but in terms of the U.S. population or the flow of immigrants are actually quite small. So I think it's better to focus sort of on standards. What types of immigrants should be allowed in? We sort of set these sort of standards, and we let these numbers adjust based on supply and demand in the market. And that is a much better way of doing things. Like when the last sort of legal immigration system was really tinkered with in 1990 was before the internet was a vibrant industry. And we are still relying on the visas created or expanded in that year to go to large technology firms in the United States. So we really need to find a way to make it a more market-driven system, a system that is flexible. One of the ways to do that is to sort of, there's a couple ways. Economists love the idea of sort of selling visas to the highest bidder or selling them at a set price, but that's fairly unpopular. Another way to do it is to sort of establish a commission to set these numbers annually. But the problems with that is that the commission will then be captured by different interest groups. So either, maybe labor unions, firms, other interest groups will have an outsized impact on that. The other way is just to set different standards and let the number of immigrants sort of change based on what happens. And that's what I really like. And this sort of feeds into what we think of, or what I think of, when it comes to merit-based immigration. Many times this administration, the Trump administration, has used the merit-based immigration rhetoric as a way to cut immigration across the board, not to expand high-skilled immigration, not to expand the immigration of people who they think will be successful, but to cut the numbers overall. And I think one of the best indicators of whether immigrants will be successful in the United States is whether they have job opportunities when they come here. So I'm not a fan of a points-based system that gives Congress a ton of opportunity to think about what it thinks will be important in the labor market for decades to come. And they've never been very good at estimating what that will be and predicting what will occur. But having a system that basically says, if you have a job offer in the United States, then you should be able to come here for a period of time. And if it works out really well, then you should be able to stay and become an American. I think is like a really good way to think about this, a core upon which to base and to judge and to compare all these other immigration ideas that are going out there. We could get a lot of inspiration from foreign countries. The sort of provincial nomination program in Canada, which allows provinces up there to sponsor a certain number of immigrants each year based on their own criteria, is something that we could very easily copy in the United States. Senators Ron Johnson and Representative Curtis introduced bills just to do that. So I think as long as we move towards sort of a more market-based system that's more flexible, that allows immigrants of whatever skill level the market demands, is a good way to reform the system. We should avoid the types of reforms that have been proposed the last couple of years by Senators Cotton, Perdue, and Donald Trump that would do the exact opposite.
So you talked about the idea that, if somebody has a job, they should be able to come and they'd be able to stay. We already let in a lot of temporary workers to the United States through our various temporary worker programs. What would you do with them? Would you continue to keep those as temporary worker programs, or would you want to try to allow those people who come in temporarily to also have a pathway to stay? Doris, if you want to answer that, or Alex.
Well, I mean, this is a favorite subject of ours because of MPI and work that we've done over the years, because we do believe that the research shows that people who come here temporarily, and when we say temporarily, we're not simply talking about agricultural work programs, for instance, and we're talking about people that have come here as students, for instance, and studied and went to graduate school on visas, that temporary status, even though that temporary status might be in some circumstances several years, is a very good proving ground. I mean, that's really that's the best way for the market to determine, that in fact there is a place for a person and for job offers to develop. So one thing that we've been pushing is the notion of what we call a bridge visa, which is the ability of people who have come in a temporary visa category to actually graduate. In other words, work along a spectrum toward ultimately green card status over the course of a number of years, if they're able to show that they have a job, that their wages are competitive. And one of the things we haven't talked about is protecting American workers and protect even playing field, because you always have to, you should, in a well-functioning immigration system, not tip the scales so that people coming as immigrants are able to compete unfairly with native-born workers. But those things can be done. And so if you had a visa that allowed, as I say, a bridging between some of the temporary visa categories and eligibility for green card status based on maintaining a job, maintaining other requirements, paying your taxes and so forth, you would be, it would be a much more seamless system that really would reflect what's taking place in this very, very decentralized labor market that we have.
Yeah, and I think the idea of a bridge visa, or we like to call it a green card light sometimes, or a like a trial visa as a step toward a green card, I think is a great way to do it, and to allow sort of to build out the current temporary migrant visa system, to allow a lot of them to be able to sort of work to prove that there will be valuable contributors to American society. It's a great step forward. And I think one of the main ways I'd like to reform some of the temporary systems to allow that is to allow more employment flexibility, more portability, make it so that these workers have to ask less of the government, have to ask for less permission basically before changing jobs, to allow them to take advantage of labor market opportunities and to see the flexibility inherent within the labor market. Because we just, under the current system, it's more difficult than it should be to change jobs. And if as a native born American citizen, if my employer treats me badly, I can change my job and there's no legal consequences. For a lot of these workers, if they do that, they quit their jobs because their employer is treating them poorly, the legal consequences, they lose their lawful migration status in the United States and they become subject to removal. So I think fixing that system, allowing a period of time for them to switch jobs and sort of widening the number of jobs that they can switch to would be a great combination reform combined with the bridge visa idea that Doris mentioned.
So just in talking about, the labor market and, and Doris, you mentioned not competing with American workers or giving an advantage to immigrants who come in. We're in an economic downturn. We know that even in the face of COVID-19, there's still been a lot of support for immigrants. I'll just point to a survey last month from the Public Religion Research Institute, which found even 79% of Republicans say immigrants are hardworking, and 76% say they have very strong family values. But it's still, people are still concerned about their economic situation. So, do you think COVID-19 has changed COVID-19 changed the prospects for reform to the legal immigration system?
I think COVID is such an extreme example, but really focuses the attention of why it is that we need flexibility in the immigration system. Economic conditions do change. They change quickly. And an immigration system probably will never be able to adjust as quickly as an economy does if something like a pandemic hits. But at the same time, the economy does go through business cycles. The economy does go through its ups and downs, and the COVID is a great example of how it may very well be the case that for a period as the current period is, you would want to be dialing back. You would want to be dialing down on your immigration. I actually don't. I do think that numbers matter to a degree, and I do think that politically numbers matter. They matter to the Congress. So I think that there does have to be some degree of oversight of the numbers, even if there are jobs available. But I also think that, the case of COVID creates, in its own way, a kind of a cognitive dissonance, in that you would think that because the unemployment is as high as it is and the job loss was as extreme and dramatic as it was, that therefore there should be no need whatsoever for foreign-born workers. But in fact, there are needs even during this period. And the best example of it is healthcare workers up and down the spectrum, from physicians to, home healthcare aides, which have really been sharply demonstrated and which are occupations that are disproportionately filled by the foreign-born. So to me, it argues for much more flexibility, as I say, but also much more understanding occupationally of where there are shifting needs that we might not be able to anticipate. There are some things you can anticipate, but something like a pandemic, we would not have been able to anticipate what its impact was on the labor market. And so I do think that with some overall oversight, not simply an employer-driven system, but some overall oversight. I mean, the commission idea is one that has been something we have felt strongly about at MPI for quite some while. You would want to be doing constant research and analysis and monitoring of what's taking place in the labor market so that changing numbers and shifting wouldn't be a once every 30 years activity. It would be an ongoing ability to administer a system in a way that is that tracks with where there are legitimate needs.
Well, from a social science perspective, COVID-19 has really shown that opposition to immigration is not very much driven by cyclical changes in the labor market or in the economy. What we saw is when COVID-19, hit, people wanted to stop immigration, but just for the period of time that the pandemic was ravaging the United States and ravaging the world. They wanted to stop immigration as a simple public health measure, but they didn't want to stop it overall. They didn't want to stop it permanently. They didn't want to use the labor market, the excuse of a poor labor market to stop it going forward. So it's really, I think, put this notion to bed. It's also shown that it's not just, the obvious workers, the healthcare workers or others who are in high demand or have a big impact in the US economy, but workers that seemingly have nothing to do with the pandemic, like IT workers in the H-1B. Like, we are all doing this wonderful conference from our homes. We are doing this because we have wonderful IT services at our employers and hired by the National Immigration Forum to set this up. If the IT services in this country were more expensive because there weren't any H-1B visas admitted for the last 30 years, for instance, we probably wouldn't be able to do this. And millions of us who have jobs wouldn't have them right now because of the lack of H-1B workers and other IT specialists who are migrants working in this country. So it really shows how much we need flexibility in the legal immigration system, because it's obvious, I think, that we need more healthcare workers, more doctors, more nurses, more vaccine researchers to come into this country to work on trying to resolve the pandemic. But who would have thought ex ante, prior to a pandemic, that yes, we also need more high-skilled tech workers to work in IT so people can keep their jobs working remotely. And this amount of economic flexibility is something that is sorely lacking from our immigration system and really needs to be built into any kind of reforms going forward, because it is just impossible to expect Congress or any other deliberative body to try to anticipate and be correct about what the future is going to hold.
So we're coming to the end of our time together. This went very, very quickly. Just wanted to close with, how optimistic do you feel about immigration reform in 2021?
Well, I suppose the short answer to that is all eyes point to Georgia. I mean, it really matters what happens with the Senate. And so, until we know whether there will be a divided government or not, it's pretty hard to, well, let me put it this way. If there is divided government, which is the Senate being in the hands of Republicans and the White House and the House being in the hands of Democrats, it will be difficult because, first of all, this new administration is going to have does have a huge agenda, starting with COVID, but the economy and many other priorities. And it's hard to imagine, as important as immigration may be, that a Biden administration will be focusing laser in on immigration in the way that the Trump administration did. The Trump administration was entirely preoccupied with immigration, whereas for a Biden administration, immigration will be an important issue, but it will be on a footing where there are many other urgent demands as well. And, there is a lot of work to be done with Congress on these issues. We have to be pretty sober about the track record here of 20 years of failings in being able to move immigration legislation forward. So I do think that there will be more of a mood for perhaps to do some discrete things. Probably the biggest candidate is a DACA Dreamer, a piece of legislation, and there will be possibly more agreement that it isn't the worst thing to just move on one particular item. But a wholesale reform of the immigration system, which is deeply, deeply needed in the way that we're arguing for, that's going to take a lot of work.
I'm very optimistic that President Biden will repeal most of the very bad executive orders and at least get started on repealing many of the regulations that have made legal immigration more difficult to the United States. So I'm optimistic about those regulatory and executive branch changes. When it comes to Congress, I'm much less optimistic for the reasons that Doris said. But if they are able to pass some kind of dreamer legislation, maybe in addition to protection for a lot of the TPS folks, and try to sort of whittle down the population of illegal and unauthorized immigrants through legalization, then I think that will bode well for the long-term prospects. Because unfortunately, we have this large unlawful immigrant population in the United States. It sucks all the air out of the rest of the debate. Even the important issues like expanding and reforming the legal immigration system. If Congress can take some moderate steps to reducing those numbers by focusing on the most, I guess, deserving or seemingly deserving subgroups of those populations, then I think it can clear the air a little bit so that we can have a better chance of having a conversation about this in the future and getting some more reform. But I mean, just to repeat what Doris said, right? It all depends on the outcome of these elections in Georgia. And so I could be singing a very different tune based on how that goes in the next few months.
Let me add one point to what Alex just said. There will definitely, I think, be COVID legislation of some kind. And COVID legislation may provide a vehicle for some immigration changes that then lead to the sort of thing that Alex is just talking about. I mean, that, you can get your toe wet on this issue and the world won't fall apart politically. So that might be a slight pathway. And that does have to do with the issues that we were just talking about, essential workers and the kinds of contributions that are important from immigrants, even in a period of pandemic.
Well, we are out of time. So clearly all eyes will be on Georgia, and we will hope that Congress will be able to do something to start to address some of these immigration issues. I'm sure we'll be talking more. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All the best.